The Occult War, Chapter 3, The Holy Alliance, Nationalism and Universalism. Our contemporaries, including those who are directly threatened by subversion, realize no more than our great-grandfathers did that in order to effectively react against this global peril, one must not return to the outlook of the 18th, 17th, or even the 16th century, but to the spirit of the Crusades. We should add that it is not a matter of returning to the use of tallow candles, coaches, serfdom, and witch-hunting, but of reverting to that spirit which did for the forces of good what subversion is doing today for those of evil. A united Christian front, headed by its leader, a single unit with lances raised, set in square formation against the infidel, which is also one, although it is everywhere, and like certain tropical insects, knows how to change its color to match that of the leaves it is gnawing in the place where it is. The Restoration, strictly speaking, was not a counter-revolution that made a blank sweep of all that had taken place, and herein lies its weakness. Forgetful of the gospel's warning, this feeble and overly cautious reaction did its best to pour the old wine of traditional royalty, that which had shaped the kingdom of France, into the new bloody flasks left by the regicides. The result, as we all know, was what had been predicted in the gospel. This chiefly defensive plan, far from leading to any triumphs, led only to disasters. It was drawn by the kind of moderates who sluggishly hold back but never make any about-face or reverse turn, so that those following them always end up treading on their corpses. In 1815, Austria alone practically and realistically grasped the historical truth. It alone, through the eyes of its chancellor, saw that the only way to react against a historical conspiratorial plan conceived long before 1789, a total conspiracy both religious and profane, was a total reaction, not a partial one simply targeting contingent symptoms. One is not cured of a poison by the administration of the same poison diluted in sugar water. When a household turns to the spiritual descendants of Louis XVI's killers for help against those of Nicholas II, how can it not perish? Likewise, when the European household turned to the spiritual descendant of Charles I's murderers in 1815 for help against those of Louis XVI, how could it not have collapsed? Once the seamless robe of Christ was torn by the Reformation, the acute xenophobia of modern nationalism ensued with its short-sighted self-interest, which only increased the advantage of the common enemy. Christian Europe thus became unmanageable. It could no longer express unity in diversity, no matter how much care may be taken to respect such diversity, which is certainly respectable in itself. Let imbeciles continue to scream from their rooftops that religion is nothing now. Religion is in fact all, and everything follows from it. This is why the Holy Alliance failed to become a new Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Alliance is to the Holy Roman Empire what the League of Nations is to the Holy Alliance. The League of Nations is a demagogy of demagogies and an incoherence of incoherences. It thus amounts to a demagogy and incoherence squared. In other words, it is a parliament of parliaments, a nation of nations, and a crowd of crowds. Besides, the Holy Alliance does not really stand halfway between the Holy Roman Empire and the League of Nations. It is rather closer to the latter. For let us not forget that two of its members, France and Britain, were already constitutional regimes at the time, with parliaments their leaders had to reckon with. To sum up, the illness which was destined to lead the Holy Alliance to its death was an original one, inherent in its moment of history. No one could do a thing against it in 1815, as there was no way of retroactively suppressing Luther, Voltaire, Calvin, and Rousseau. It was the ghosts of these men, along with those of Cromwell and Robespierre, united in the fight against their common enemy, that ultimately murdered the Holy Alliance. For the Alliance had failed to suppress them a second time in their graves. An outward sign of this original sin was the absence of the Pope. The Pope would have been a rallying symbol of unity. The Pope is the only person on earth who can claim to be above all and stand out like a common banner without anyone down here feeling humiliated or belittled, for he is only a defenseless moral principle, an unarmed old man who represents he whose kingdom is not of this world. Once the Pope is not there to say, Pax vobiscum, instead of the silence of bowed, crowned heads, all we have is the voice of people singing France d'abord, Italia soprattutto, or Deutschland über alles, so loudly as to make their neighbors inaudible. Right from its birth, the Holy Alliance carried a deadly illness in its bosom. As we shall see later on in this work, the two states which had sprung from the Reformation, and which nourished the memory of the Revolution, were its enfants terribles, and ultimately tore it to pieces. This process lasted some time, almost 40 years, during which the void grew bigger and bigger. Imperceptibly, the Holy Alliance, or what was still left of it on paper, became a myth whose only tangible expression was Austria. With its kingdoms, principalities, and earldoms, and its peoples, languages, and races, all peacefully united under the same scepter, this vestige of the Holy Roman Empire already embodied, albeit on a lesser scale, the form and character of a Holy Alliance, in which Catholicism held primacy over nationalism. Both politically and religiously, Austria was thus the Catholic state par excellence. This is why it became an object of hatred for all forms of Protestantism, nationalism, and democracy. Austria alone might have continued to be the driving force behind the Holy Alliance, which it assimilated to the Holy Roman Empire without having managed to include the Pope within it. For what could it do against 3 or even 4 other states? Austria remained such until the day when its former partners inevitably turned against her. The voice of historical affinities, freed from contingencies and from the accident of the Holy Alliance, and revamped by the untiring action of modern subversion, ultimately made itself heard. It had been stifled by fear for 40 years, but the natural inclination that had been suppressed came back with a bang. The Revolution of 1830 marks the historical failure of the Holy Alliance. Bearing in mind what we have said so far, let us now examine why Metternich's idea failed, after having given the people of Europe 40 years of peace and prosperity. Metternich's great salvation plan failed because, despite the agreements signed, a united front against the return of the Revolution existed only on paper. If the most important clause of these agreements, the right, or rather duty to intervene, had been followed, it is most likely that after 1789, which was swept away by 1815, there would have been no 1848. Consequently, as everything is linked, there would have been no 1866, no 1870, and finally no 1914 or 1917, years that have plunged us into the deadly doldrums in which we lay dying, and all for the greater glory of the Masonic Triangle and the Star of Israel. If the solidarity among kings at a time when they were still in control of the situation had been anything like that among the Jews, the latter would never have suppressed the former. Yet despite the lessons of the French Revolution, after averting imminent dangers, monarchs returned to thinking and acting as they had in the 18th century, that is, according to contingent, self-serving interests. Leaving aside the case of Belgium and that of the Spanish colonies in South America, which are not as relevant to our subject, it was France which delivered the first blow against the Pact of Vienna. The Revolution of 1830 was a case foreseen by the principle of intervention. Legitimate sovereigns ruling by grace of God had mutually ensured their own legitimacy. This time the insurrection ousted a legitimate king ruling by grace of God, a sovereign whom God alone ought to have called to himself, or a legitimate successor should have replaced. A legitimate successor indeed existed, yet another one was chosen. This new successor embodied the happy medium mentality, the bourgeois and mediocre mentality par excellence. He stood for the monarchical tradition and the revolutionary one simultaneously. This man had been chosen because the people liked them. He was the king of the French, not the king of France, not the hereditary holder of France, but rather the first civil servant of the country. Like all civil servants, he could be dismissed. On an official level, too, he was described not as ruler by grace of God, but by grace of the nation, a new formula which clearly applied not to a monarchy, but to a republic posing as a monarchy. The kingdom was thus stripped of the principle that constituted its very raison d'etre. The distinction between these two formulas is no mere nuance, for a chasm exists between the two worlds they embody, that of logic and that of illogic. Logically speaking, what is above cannot be straightforwardly subordinated to what is below, without ceasing to be above. The claim that the people is not the sum of the individuals is comprised of, but rather a quasi-metaphysical entity beyond and above all, is nothing but sophistry, or to put it more simply, a bad joke. This claim is extremely dangerous, despite its apparent moderation, whose aim is not to frighten moderate milieus. We should not forget that even socialists and Bolsheviks are mostly saying the same thing. Factory workers in industrial countries such as Britain and workers and farmers in rural countries such as Russia make up the majority of the people. Hence, by the democratic virtue of numbers, they make up the people with a capital P. Once we accept the thesis that power stems from the will of the people, there is no longer any need to theoretically proceed on to Bolshevism. There is only a logical and progressive development of the doctrine. An actual chasm exists only between the idea of rule by grace of God and that of rule by will of the nation. It is here that this slippery slope starts. The entire history of the 19th century proves it. Leaving Switzerland aside, France was the first country on the continent to cross this chasm for the second time, in 1830. This was a repetition of the revolution, yet it was so discreetly carried out that no one foresaw its consequences, and no one suspected that France had, in principle, ceased to be a monarchy. With the return of the tricolor in place of the fleur-de-lis, France reverted to its revolutionary and Napoleonic tradition. It turned to promoting democracy and national self-determination, thus newly adopting the revolutionary testament of which Napoleon had claimed to be the executor at St. Helena. It was to fight against these very principles that the Holy Alliance had been established in the first place. There is only one international right, that of divine right of the principle of authority from on high. By virtue of this principle, not merely the king, but also every father and legitimate superior represents God, provided he keeps the commandments. Likewise, there is only one international left, that of popular will, of the principle of authority from below, of authority stemming from those who should obey. But if those below do not obey, then there can be no order, not even in a small shop or humble family, not to mention in a state. For how could one both command in principle and obey in practice? Take the Bolshevik Soviets. In theory, the colonels and officers only give orders according to the will of those who should obey them in their regiments, namely the representatives of the soldiers gathered in the assembly, or Soviet. This is what happens when the principle of national will is logically applied on all levels. Instead of being illogically confined to any individual one. This is a principle opposite to that of divine right, by virtue of which colonels will give orders in the name of the king, who in turn will rule in God's name. The most crucial difference between these two principles rests on a point of the utmost importance, the fact that the government of divine right is neither arbitrary nor absolute, since it is guided and limited by the laws of Christian morality. Nor could things be any different. All we need is a little logic to understand that a visible lieutenant of God, whether he is a king, father, or leader, cannot act against the precise instructions given by his invisible captain, God or Christ, without undermining his own authority. So-called national will, which is to say the will of the majority, a plebeian, ignorant, inconsistent, and incoherent will, has no one it must be accountable towards. It remains legitimate, legal, and supreme, whatever it may do, whatever tribulations it imposes, and whatever crimes, impieties, extravagances, and abominations it commits. This will does not take the place of the king, but of he who makes all kings rule, God. People do not realize that this path remains legally open as soon as the principle of national will has replaced that of divine right. All European nations now find themselves on this path. This is the reason why they are so reluctant to fight Bolshevism, which is merely preceding them along it. For ultimately, Bolshevism stems from the same ideological principle, the alleged will of the masses of farmers and workers, alleged, that is, because the masses actually play no part in determining the public will. It is the anonymous, imperceptible, and invulnerable that does. So in their stead, here and there. The anonymous can only be grasped and perceived when it takes the form of the people's commissar, invariably a Jew, as one would expect. In other cases, however, it makes sure to conceal itself more prudently. It is the will of the anonymous which replaces that of kings, or even God. But while all European nations now find themselves on this path, things were not so in 1830. At the time, France alone abandoned the body of nations destined to serve as a bulwark against the revolution. France walked out just like that, without banging any doors, and joined the other side of the barricade. Many Frenchmen were very proud of this. Indeed, many still are. But how long will they continue to feel that way? Only the future will tell.